The North Atlantic in 1943 was a graveyard. Beneath its grey, churning waters lay the twisted wreckage of hundreds of merchant ships, their hulls torn open by German torpedoes, their cargoes of food, fuel, and ammunition scattered across the ocean floor. Above the surface, the convoys that sustained Britain's survival moved in desperate formations, zigzagging across thousands of miles of open water, knowing that beneath them, in the cold darkness, German U-boats prowled like wolves. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its most critical phase, and the Allies were losing. Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The statistics were catastrophic. In the first half of 1943 alone, German submarines sank over 300 Allied vessels. Ships were being destroyed faster than the shipyards of America and Britain could replace them. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. If the losses continued at this rate, Britain would be starved into submission within months, and the planned invasion of Europe would become impossible. Every cargo of grain from Canada, every tanker of oil from Texas, every transport of soldiers and supplies had to cross this killing field, and the U-boats were winning. The German submarines had evolved into sophisticated killing machines by 1943. Their greatest advantage wasn't their torpedoes or their cunning tactics, it was their ears. Deep beneath the waves, German hydrophone operators sat in darkness, wearing headphones connected to sensitive underwater microphones that could detect the sound of ship propellers from miles away. In the vast emptiness of the Atlantic, sound traveled far underwater, and every Allied ship announced its presence with a distinctive acoustic signature: the rhythmic thrashing of propellers, the mechanical hum of engines, the groaning of hull plates under stress. To a trained hydrophone operator, the ocean was anything but silent. It was a concert of information. They could count the number of ships in a convoy by distinguishing individual propeller sounds. They could estimate a ship's speed by the frequency of its engine noise. They could calculate range and bearing with remarkable accuracy. This acoustic intelligence allowed U-boat commanders to position their submarines for perfect attack angles, often without ever raising a periscope or exposing themselves to radar detection. The Allies had developed numerous countermeasures: radar, sonar, depth charges, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, but none of these addressed the fundamental problem: their ships were simply too loud. Every convoy broadcast its position across the ocean like a radio beacon, and no amount of naval firepower could make a ship that had already been detected and targeted truly safe. The scientific establishment had examined the problem extensively. Naval architects studied hull designs. Engineers modified propellers and engine mounts. Acoustics experts from universities were recruited to analyze sound propagation underwater. The conclusion was always the same: there was no practical way to make a large merchant ship significantly quieter. The noise was inherent to the physics of moving thousands of tons of steel through water at speed. The propellers had to push against the ocean with tremendous force, creating cavitation bubbles that collapsed with distinctive popping sounds. The engines had to generate enormous power, transmitting vibrations through every rivet and plate of the hull. The very structure of the ship resonated like a giant musical instrument. Some improvements were possible: rubber mounts for engines, redesigned propeller blades, sound dampening materials in certain locations, but these modifications were expensive, time-consuming to install, and produced only marginal reductions in noise. The experts agreed: making a convoy truly quiet was impossible. You couldn't change the fundamental physics. And that's where the official thinking stopped, at the boundary of what trained minds believed could not be done. Thomas Lawson was nobody's idea of a military innovator. At 43 years old, he was a merchant marine cook assigned to the SS William Harrington, a Liberty ship that hauled cargo between New York and Liverpool. Tommy, as everyone called him, had spent 20 years working in ship galleys, which meant he knew more about feeding hungry sailors on rolling seas than about naval warfare or acoustic physics. He was built like a barrel, with thick forearms scarred from kitchen burns and a face that seemed permanently flushed from the heat of stoves. He'd never finished high school, having gone to sea at 16 when his father's construction business collapsed during the Depression. His world was flour and salt pork, inventory lists and meal schedules, the constant battle to produce edible food under impossible conditions. While officers on the bridge worried about U-boats and convoy formations, Tommy worried about whether the potatoes would last until Liverpool and how to stop the fresh eggs from cracking in rough weather. He was invisible to most of the ship's company, just another crew member doing an unglamorous but necessary job. His assigned station during U-boat attacks was in the galley, securing loose items and standing by with coffee and sandwiches for men who might be fighting for their lives. He wasn't expected to think about naval tactics or weapons systems. He was expected to keep his head down and do his job. But Tommy Lawson had one quality that would prove more valuable than any engineering degree: he paid attention to things other people ignored. It started with a seemingly unrelated observation during the William Harrington's third convoy run. Tommy was working at the sink, washing an enormous pot that had held bean soup for 80 men, when the ship's engines changed rhythm. He'd learned to read the ship's moods through these vibrations. Every vessel had its own personality, transmitted through the deck plates and bulkheads. But this time he noticed something odd. The pot he was washing, still half full of water, had been vibrating visibly, creating tiny ripples across the surface. When he emptied the water out to scrub the bottom, the pot's vibration changed dramatically. It rang with a different tone, louder and more sustained. He filled it again, and the vibration dampened, became muted. Empty and fill, the difference was obvious once you paid attention. Any cook knew this phenomenon: a pot of water on the stove made less noise than an empty pot. The water absorbed the vibrations, dampened the sound. But Tommy was thinking about it differently now, standing in a ship that was trying desperately not to be heard by submarines that were trying desperately to hear it. The ship's hull was essentially a giant metal container, and it rang like a bell with every vibration from the engines and propellers. But what if, somehow, that resonance could be dampened? What if water, the very medium through which the sound was traveling, could also be used to stop the sound at its source? The idea seemed absurd at first, even to Tommy himself. He wasn't a scientist. He didn't know the technical terms for what he was thinking about, concepts like acoustic impedance or resonance damping or vibration isolation. He just knew what he'd observed with the pot, and he wondered if the same principle might work on a larger scale. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that he'd noticed something important. Over the next several days, he paid closer attention to the ship's sounds. He put his ear against bulkheads in different parts of the vessel. He noticed that some areas seemed to transmit engine vibration more than others. The empty cargo holds, essentially huge hollow metal boxes, seemed to ring with particular intensity. He began to form a theory, crude and unscientific but based on genuine observation. The hollow spaces in the ship were amplifying the noise, acting like the body of a guitar, and those amplified vibrations were being transmitted through the hull into the water. If those spaces could be filled with water or partially filled, maybe the amplification would stop. Maybe the ship would become quieter. It was an insane idea in many ways, deliberately flooding parts of your own ship with tons of seawater, adding weight that would slow you down and reduce cargo capacity. But they were already sailing with empty holds on return trips, and speed didn't matter much if you were dead. Tommy knew he should probably keep this thought to himself. He was a cook, not a naval architect. Who would listen to him? But the next convoy run changed everything. The William Harrington was traveling in a formation of 42 ships, protected by 6 escort destroyers and a corvette. It was April 1943, and the U-boats were having their most successful month of the entire war. 3 days out from New York, the convoy ran into a wolf pack, a coordinated group of 8 German submarines that had been vectored to intercept them. The attack came at night, which was when the U-boats preferred to strike. They would surface in the darkness, invisible to radar at that time, and use their diesel engines to race ahead of the convoy, then submerge and wait for the ships to sail into their trap. The first torpedo hit at 2:30 a.m., striking an oil tanker that erupted in flames visible for miles. Then another ship was hit, and another. The escort destroyers charged around dropping depth charges, their sonar pinging frantically, but in the chaos and darkness they were firing at shadows. By dawn, 7 ships were gone, and the U-boats had melted away into the depths. Tommy stood on deck that morning, looking at the gaps in the convoy formation where ships used to be, and he thought about the men who'd been on those vessels, men he'd probably shared a beer with in port, men who were now dead or floating in life rafts hoping for rescue. He thought about the U-boat crews sitting in the darkness below, listening with their hydrophones, picking their targets based on sound alone. And he thought about his crazy idea with the water. That afternoon, he made a decision that would either make him look like a fool or change the war. He went to see the captain. Captain Robert Hendricks was a merchant marine veteran who'd been commanding ships since before Tommy had gone to sea. He was a practical man, respected by his crew but not known for tolerating nonsense. When Tommy knocked on his cabin door and asked to speak with him about U-boat tactics, Hendricks assumed it was going to be one of those conversations, some enlisted man with too much time to think, probably wanting to suggest they mount more guns or sail faster or some other impossible thing. He almost dismissed Tommy before he'd even started talking. But something in the cook's demeanor made him pause. This wasn't a frightened man looking for reassurance or a bored sailor spinning fantasies. Tommy was nervous, yes, but he was also serious, almost apologetic, as if he knew his idea sounded crazy but felt compelled to share it anyway. Hendricks lit his pipe and told him to go ahead. Tommy explained what he'd noticed about the pot in the galley, about the vibrations in the cargo holds, about his theory that deliberately flooding certain empty spaces might dampen the ship's acoustic signature. He didn't use fancy words because he didn't know them, but his explanation was clear. Hendricks listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Tommy finished, there was a long silence. The captain puffed on his pipe, thinking. His first instinct was to dismiss the idea. It was too simple, too unscientific, the kind of thing that couldn't possibly work because real naval architects would have already thought of it if it could. But Hendricks had been at sea long enough to know that book learning didn't solve every problem. He'd seen men with fancy degrees make catastrophic mistakes because they couldn't think outside their training. And there was something appealing about Tommy's observation. It was based on direct experience, not theory. Hendricks asked the question that mattered: would it work? Tommy was honest, he didn't know for certain, but he thought it might, and it seemed worth trying since they were going to sail with empty holds anyway on the return trip. The captain made his decision quickly, the way good commanders do. "All right, Tommy. We'll try it on the way back to New York. But you're going to help me explain this to the chief engineer, because he's going to think we've both lost our minds." Chief Engineer Donald Walsh was, as predicted, skeptical. He was a University of Michigan graduate who understood stress calculations, metallurgy, and maritime engineering. The idea of deliberately flooding cargo holds to reduce noise struck him as somewhere between naive and dangerous. He raised legitimate concerns. The added weight would affect the ship's trim and stability, the salt water would cause corrosion, they'd need to ensure proper venting to prevent pressure problems, and there was absolutely no guarantee it would work. In fact, his training suggested it probably wouldn't work. Water added weight and drag, which would make the ship noisier through cavitation, not quieter. But Captain Hendricks played his authority card. They were going to try it, on a limited basis, on the return trip. Walsh could supervise to ensure it was done safely. They would monitor the results. If it didn't work or caused problems, they'd pump the holds out and never speak of it again. If it did work, well, that would be worth some corrosion and trim adjustments. Walsh reluctantly agreed, but insisted on doing calculations first. They would only partially flood specific holds, and they'd carefully monitor stability. Over the next few days, while the William Harrington sat in Liverpool unloading cargo, Walsh worked out a plan. They would flood the forward holds to about 20% capacity, enough water to dampen vibrations, he hoped, but not enough to dangerously affect the ship's handling. It would add roughly 200 tons of weight, which would slow them by perhaps half a knot but shouldn't cause serious problems. The pumps could remove the water quickly if needed. On paper, it seemed manageable, if pointless. The return convoy departed Liverpool on a grey morning in late April, 45 ships arranged in 9 columns, escorted by destroyers and corvettes that were already worn down from constant action. The William Harrington had flooded its forward holds according to Walsh's calculations. Tommy felt a strange mixture of pride and terror. What if his idea not only didn't work but somehow made things worse? What if the added weight caused problems? What if he'd just convinced the captain to do something that got them all killed? The first 2 days passed without incident, but on the third night, the convoy's luck ran out. U-boats made contact and began shadowing them, reporting position to other submarines in the area. The convoy commander ordered an emergency course change, trying to shake the pursuit, but everyone knew what was coming. In his cramped cabin, Tommy lay awake listening to the sound of the ship, wondering if the water in the holds was making any difference at all. There was no way for him to know. The hydrophones were on the U-boats, not on his ship. He'd either saved them or done nothing, and he wouldn't know which until torpedoes started hitting or didn't. It was the most helpless feeling he'd ever experienced, being responsible for something he had no control over and no way to measure. On deck, the gun crews stood at their stations, scanning the darkness for periscopes or surfaced submarines. Below, the engine room crew maintained their machinery, knowing they were the loudest thing on the ship and therefore the priority target. And somewhere out there in the black water, U-boat hydrophone operators were listening, searching for the sounds of prey, turning their wheels slowly, focusing their underwater ears on the convoy that had just appeared at the edge of their detection range. What happened next would only be fully understood after the war, when Allied intelligence analysts gained access to German U-boat logs and interrogated captured submarine commanders. In the moment, the men aboard the William Harrington only knew that the attack, when it came, seemed to bypass them in a way that felt impossible. The first torpedo struck a ship 3 columns over, a Liberty ship carrying grain, which took the hit amidships and began to list immediately. Flares went up. The escorts charged toward the estimated U-boat position, depth charges rolling off their racks. Another ship was hit, this one a tanker on the convoy's starboard edge. It didn't explode spectacularly like the tanker in the previous convoy, but it was clearly doomed, its crew already abandoning ship. The attack continued sporadically throughout the night, a torpedo here, a torpedo there, but never the sustained slaughter of the previous convoy. And somehow, incredibly, the William Harrington was never targeted. Ships ahead of them were hit. Ships behind them were hit. But not them. Tommy wanted to believe it was his water-filled holds, but he didn't dare suggest it. It might have been luck. It might have been the escort's aggressive depth charging. It might have been the convoy's evasive course changes. When dawn came and the U-boats broke off the attack, 6 ships had been lost, tragic, but far fewer than the previous convoy's casualties. The William Harrington sailed on, unmolested, arriving in New York 10 days later with her hull intact and her crew alive. In the captain's cabin that night, 3 men shared a bottle of whiskey: Hendricks, Walsh, and Tommy Lawson. They didn't know for certain, but they wondered. They hoped. And they decided to try it again. Over the next 3 convoy runs, Captain Hendricks kept his ship's holds partially flooded during crossings, and each time the William Harrington seemed to draw less attention from U-boats than comparable ships. It might have been coincidence, convoy composition, weather, patrol patterns, all affected which ships were targeted. But by the 3rd run, even Chief Engineer Walsh was becoming convinced that something real was happening. The ship was still making normal speed, handling well, and somehow attracting less hostile attention than statistical probability suggested it should. Hendricks finally filed a report with the convoy commodore, expecting to be dismissed as a crank. Instead, something unexpected happened. The commodore was interested. He'd been at sea long enough to know that sometimes the best innovations came from practical men solving practical problems, not from research laboratories. He forwarded Hendricks' report up the chain of command with a recommendation that it be tested under controlled conditions. The report eventually reached the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, the nerve center of the Battle of the Atlantic, where Admiral Sir Max Houghton commanded the British anti-submarine forces. Houghton was an aggressive, unconventional officer who'd commanded submarines himself in World War I and understood the U-boat threat intimately. He was also, crucially, willing to listen to ideas from any source if they might save ships. When one of his staff officers brought him a report about a merchant ship cook who thought flooding cargo holds might reduce submarine detection, Houghton's first reaction was amusement. But he didn't dismiss it. Instead, he ordered a proper test. The Royal Navy's experimental establishment at HMS Osprey had facilities for underwater acoustic testing, essentially a protected bay with hydrophones positioned at various depths and distances, used for testing submarine quieting techniques and acoustic detection equipment. In June 1943, 2 identical Liberty ships were brought to Osprey for comparative testing. One sailed with empty holds, the other with holds flooded according to the method Tommy Lawson had described, which was now being called Lawson's ballast in the reports. The ships made identical runs through the test area while Navy hydrophone operators, blind to which ship was which, listened and recorded what they heard. The results were stunning. The ship with water-flooded holds produced an acoustic signature approximately 40% quieter than the empty ship, not completely silent, but dramatically reduced. The difference was most pronounced in the low-frequency rumble that carried farthest underwater, the sound that allowed U-boats to detect convoys at maximum range. Further testing revealed why it worked. The water in the holds was acting as a damping mass, absorbing vibrations from the engines and propellers before they could resonate through the hull structure. The empty holds had been acting like amplification chambers, taking relatively small vibrations and magnifying them. The water stopped this amplification without significantly affecting the ship's mechanical function. It was brilliant in its simplicity, so simple that trained acoustic engineers were embarrassed they hadn't thought of it themselves. The principle was well known in laboratory settings, but no one had considered applying it to ships this way because it seemed too crude, too low-tech, too much like something a ship's cook would think of. Which, of course, it was. Admiral Horton immediately ordered the technique implemented across the convoy system. It wasn't perfect, it only worked on ships with empty or partially empty holds, and it required careful calculation to avoid stability problems. But in the savage calculus of the Atlantic War, even a 40% reduction in detection range was enormous. If U-boats couldn't hear a convoy until it was 40% closer, they had less time to maneuver into attack position. They couldn't concentrate wolf packs as effectively. They missed opportunities because ships passed by undetected. The operational impact was multiplied by the fact that German U-boat tactics depended heavily on detecting convoys at maximum range and then organizing coordinated attacks. If the detection happened later, the coordination became more difficult, and individual submarines were more likely to face prepared escorts rather than achieving surprise. By August 1943, most Allied merchant ships on Atlantic runs were using some version of Lawson's ballast method when sailing with less than full cargo. The Germans noticed that convoys seemed to be becoming harder to find, but they attributed this to improved radar, more aggressive air patrols, and better escort tactics, all of which were also true. They never realized that part of the change was something as simple as water in cargo holds. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was turning for many reasons. The Allies had cracked German naval codes, long-range patrol aircraft were closing the black gap in mid-Atlantic air coverage, escort carriers were providing air support for convoys, and improved radar and sonar were making U-boats more vulnerable. But Lawson's innovation was part of this turning tide, saving ships and lives at a critical moment. Tommy Lawson himself became briefly famous within the Merchant Marine Service, though he remained largely unknown to the public. He was summoned to Halifax to brief convoy commodores on his technique, an experience he found profoundly uncomfortable, standing before a room full of senior officers and trying to explain something he'd figured out by accident. He was awarded a commendation letter from Admiral Horton, which he kept in a drawer and rarely mentioned. The Navy offered to bring him to Washington as a consultant, but he declined. He was a cook, not a desk man, and he wanted to stay at sea. Captain Hendricks later recommended him for a decoration, but Tommy asked that the recommendation be withdrawn. He hadn't done it for recognition, he said. He'd done it because men were dying, and he thought he might have a way to save some of them. That was all. He returned to the William Harrington and continued making his rounds across the Atlantic, serving meals and standing watches, just another merchant sailor doing his job in a war that seemed to go on forever. But the men who knew the story looked at him differently now, not as just a cook, but as someone who'd changed the course of the war through nothing more than paying attention and having the courage to speak up about what he'd noticed. The full impact of Lawson's innovation wouldn't be quantified until after the war, when operational researchers analyzed the statistics of convoy losses. They estimated that the acoustic damping technique, combined with other improvements, contributed to a significant reduction in successful U-boat attacks during the second half of 1943. By May 1943, before the technique's widespread adoption, U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate of about 96 ships per month. By December 1943, that number had dropped to 25 ships per month, and by mid-1944, the U-boat threat had been effectively neutralized. No single factor caused this dramatic reversal. It was a combination of technological, tactical, and intelligence improvements, implemented by thousands of people making thousands of contributions. But Tommy Lawson's water ballast method was one of those contributions, saving an unknown but significant number of ships and the men who crewed them. Some estimates suggested that if just 20 ships escaped detection and destruction because of reduced acoustic signatures, that represented approximately 800 lives saved and roughly 100,000 tons of critical cargo delivered. In the brutal mathematics of total war, that was a substantial impact from one cook's simple observation about vibrating pots. After the war, Tommy Lawson returned to civilian life with little fanfare. He worked for a shipping company for a few years, then retired to a small house in Maine where he could watch the ocean he'd spent his life crossing. He rarely talked about the war or his contribution to winning it. When researchers occasionally tracked him down in later years to interview him for historical records, he was always modest, almost dismissive of his own role. He'd just noticed something, he'd say. Anybody could have done it. But that wasn't quite true, because countless other people had sailed on those ships, experiencing the same vibrations and sounds, and none of them had made the connection he made. The story of Thomas Lawson illuminates something important about innovation and problem-solving that extends far beyond World War II naval warfare. Throughout history, major breakthroughs have often come from unexpected sources, people outside the formal expert community who look at established problems with fresh eyes, unburdened by the assumptions that limit more trained minds. Experts are invaluable, but they can also develop conceptual blind spots, dismissing possibilities that seem to violate their understanding of how things work. Tommy Lawson didn't know enough about acoustic engineering to know that his idea shouldn't work, so he proposed it anyway. And because he proposed it, and because a few people in authority were wise enough to listen, thousands of sailors made it home who might otherwise have drowned in the cold Atlantic. The broader lesson here is about the importance of listening to observations from all levels of an organization or society. Hierarchies exist for good reasons. Expertise matters, experience matters, formal training matters. But hierarchies can also suppress valuable information if they're too rigid, if they create an environment where people feel their observations won't be valued unless they come with the right credentials. Captain Hendricks deserves immense credit not just for implementing Tommy's idea, but for listening in the first place, for taking seriously a suggestion from a ship's cook about submarine warfare tactics. How many other potential innovations were lost during the war, or in any field at any time, because someone with a good observation didn't feel empowered to speak up, or because someone in authority didn't bother to listen? The military, for all its necessary rigidity and hierarchy, has historically been better than many institutions at recognizing merit wherever it appears. Some of the most significant military innovations, from battlefield tactics to weapon systems to organizational structures, have come from relatively junior personnel who noticed something the generals missed. But this only works when the organization creates channels for these observations to flow upward, and when leaders are secure enough to consider ideas that didn't originate at their level. Tommy Lawson's story is thus not just about acoustic damping or anti-submarine warfare, it's about the human and organizational factors that enable innovation under pressure. There's also something profound in the specific nature of Tommy's insight. It came from doing mundane work attentively. He wasn't conducting research or trying to invent something. He was washing dishes, doing the same repetitive kitchen work he'd done for 20 years, but he was doing it mindfully, noticing things. In our modern culture, we often valorize dramatic eureka moments and lone genius breakthroughs, but most innovation is more prosaic than that. It's someone paying attention to the details of their daily work, noticing patterns, making connections, and having the presence of mind to recognize when those observations might matter beyond their immediate context. How many insights do we miss because we're going through our days on autopilot, not really observing, not making connections? Tommy's pot was vibrating differently depending on whether it held water. Thousands of cooks had probably noticed the same thing over the centuries, but only Tommy made the mental leap from kitchen phenomenon to naval warfare application. That leap required not just observation but also a certain kind of creative thinking, the ability to see analogies across different domains. The pot was like the ship, the water was like water. It was obvious in retrospect, which is how the best solutions always seem. After the war ended, the water ballast technique was largely forgotten outside of specialized naval history circles. The threat it had been designed to counter, German U-boats, was gone, and new generations of submarines used active sonar rather than just passive listening, changing the acoustic warfare equation entirely. The Liberty ships that had carried Tommy's ballast were scrapped or sold off. The specific tactical problem had been solved and then rendered obsolete by the end of the conflict. But the general principles remain valid. Sound propagates through structures in ways that can be dampened with proper engineering. Attention to acoustic signatures matters for stealth, and simple solutions can be surprisingly effective. Modern submarines use sophisticated sound dampening techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1943, but they operate on principles that Tommy Lawson understood intuitively when he watched his soup pot vibrate on the galley counter. Naval architects designing today's stealth ships consider acoustic signatures as carefully as radar profiles, using advanced materials and complex designs to minimize detection. They're solving the same problem Tommy solved, just with better tools and more complete understanding of the physics involved. But Tommy got there first, in the middle of a war, with nothing but observation and courage. The story of Tommy Lawson also raises questions about how we remember and honor contributions to historical events. The Battle of the Atlantic is well documented. We know about the code breakers at Bletchley Park, the convoy escort commanders, the technological developments in radar and sonar, the strategic decisions made by Churchill and Roosevelt, the bravery of merchant sailors who kept crossing the ocean despite horrific losses. These are all legitimate and important parts of the story. But how many Tommy Lawsons are there in history, people who made real, measurable contributions that saved lives and affected outcomes, but whose names and stories have been largely forgotten because they were too ordinary, too far down the hierarchy, too unglamorous? Military decorations and official histories tend to focus on commanders and combat heroes, on people who fit certain narratives about leadership and valor. A cook who suggested putting water in cargo holds doesn't fit the traditional hero narrative, even though his contribution arguably saved more lives than many of the actions that did earn medals and recognition. This isn't to diminish genuine combat heroism. People who ran toward danger to save others deserve all the honor they receive. But it's worth considering what other kinds of heroism and contribution we might be overlooking. What other Tommy Lawsons might be out there in every field and every era, doing important work that goes unrecognized because it doesn't fit our preconceptions about what important work looks like. In the decades after World War II, a few military historians and naval researchers did recognize the significance of what became known as the Lawson technique. It appeared in technical publications about anti-submarine warfare, usually as a footnote or brief mention. Some accounts credited it incorrectly to naval engineers who'd refined and formalized the method after Tommy's initial observation, a common pattern where the formal developer gets credit rather than the original observer. A few articles got the story right, though they often couldn't track down Tommy himself for interviews, or found that he didn't want to talk about it. One researcher who did find him in the 1960s reported that Tommy seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention. He'd noticed something about pots and water, he'd mentioned it to the captain, other people had tested it and implemented it, and that was that. He didn't see himself as an inventor or innovator, he'd just been trying to help. This humility was typical of his generation of sailors, men who'd done extraordinary things but regarded them as simply what needed to be done under the circumstances. They'd fought a war, done their part, and then come home to build lives and careers, carrying their experiences quietly rather than dwelling on them. It's a different relationship to heroism than many modern people have, less self-conscious, less interested in recognition or narrative. Tommy Lawson had helped save ships and lives, and that was satisfaction enough. He didn't need history to remember his name. But history should remember, because stories like Tommy Lawson's teach us things we need to know about innovation, problem-solving, organizational dynamics, and human potential. They remind us that expertise and formal training, while valuable, don't have a monopoly on insight. They demonstrate that paying attention to the details of daily work can reveal patterns and possibilities that pure theory might miss. They show that courage isn't just physical bravery in combat, it's also the courage to speak up when you're the low-ranking person in the room, to propose an idea that might sound crazy, to risk looking foolish in the hope that you might actually be onto something important. How many people have observations or ideas that might matter but don't share them because they assume someone smarter has already thought of it, or because they don't want to risk embarrassment, or because they don't think anyone would listen to them anyway? Tommy Lawson could easily have said nothing, figured that if flooding holds was a good idea the naval architects would have already done it, and spent the rest of the war just cooking meals and hoping his ship wouldn't be torpedoed. But he spoke up, and because he did, the odds of survival improved for thousands of sailors who never knew his name and never knew why their convoys seemed to attract fewer attacks in late 1943 than earlier in the year. The broader context of the Battle of the Atlantic makes Tommy's contribution all the more significant. This wasn't a sideshow or a minor theater of operations. It was, in Churchill's assessment, the campaign that could have lost the war for the Allies. Britain was an island that depended entirely on imports for survival. Food, fuel, raw materials, military equipment, even the American and Canadian troops who would eventually invade Europe, everything had to cross the Atlantic in the face of the U-boat threat. If the submarines had succeeded in cutting off Britain's supply lines, the entire Allied strategy would have collapsed. There would have been no D-Day, no liberation of Western Europe, and the war's outcome could have been radically different. This wasn't hypothetical or exaggerated danger. In the spring of 1943, it was genuinely uncertain whether the convoy system would survive. The Germans were building U-boats faster than the Allies were sinking them, and they were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The mathematical trend lines were moving in Germany's favor. That this trend reversed in the second half of 1943, that the Allies gained and maintained control of the Atlantic and were therefore able to accumulate the forces for the Normandy invasion, was the result of numerous factors coming together at the same time, but acoustic damping was one of those factors. Tommy Lawson was one small piece of a massive puzzle, but every piece mattered. Removed any one of them, the code breaking, the radar, the long-range aircraft, the escort carriers, the acoustic damping, the convoy tactics, and the outcome might have been different. It's also worth considering how Tommy's innovation fit into the larger story of World War II as a scientific and technological conflict. This was the war that gave us radar, sonar, jet engines, guided missiles, nuclear weapons, and countless other technological advances. It was in many ways the first war where scientific research and engineering capabilities were as important as battlefield tactics and industrial production. Both sides mobilized their scientific communities, creating research programs that transformed military capabilities and, in many cases, laid the groundwork for post-war technological development. The Manhattan Project is the most famous example, but there were hundreds of other programs working on everything from proximity fuses to synthetic rubber to advanced aircraft designs. In this context, Tommy Lawson represents a different kind of technological contribution, not a product of organized research and development, not the result of teams of scientists working in laboratories, but a field innovation born from practical observation and common sense. The military's R&D establishment was crucial, but it couldn't think of everything, couldn't solve every problem, and sometimes missed solutions that were obvious to someone with different perspective and experience. The ideal system is one that gets the best of both worlds: formal research programs to push the boundaries of what's possible, but also channels for practical observations from people doing the actual work in the field. Tommy's idea made it through the system because enough people along the chain of command were wise enough to recognize potential merit even from an unconventional source, and because there were mechanisms in place to test and implement promising ideas quickly. Today, in the 21st century, the Tommy Lawson story remains relevant to anyone thinking about innovation in complex organizations. Modern corporations, government agencies, military services, and other large institutions all grapple with the same challenge: how do you stay innovative and adaptive while maintaining the expertise and structure necessary for effective operation? How do you create an environment where good ideas can come from anywhere, not just from designated experts or senior leaders? Many organizations talk about fostering innovation and being open to ideas from all levels, but far fewer actually implement cultural and structural mechanisms to make this happen. It requires more than just an open-door policy or a suggestion box. It requires leaders who genuinely listen, evaluation processes that assess ideas on merit rather than source, protection for people who propose unconventional solutions, and a willingness to test promising concepts even when they come from unexpected places. The military got this right in Tommy Lawson's case. Captain Hendricks listened, Admiral Horton ordered proper testing, and the idea was implemented once proven effective. But how many other organizations would have dismissed the cook's suggestion out of hand, or thanked him politely and then done nothing, or gotten bogged down in bureaucratic review processes until the idea lost relevance? The lesson isn't that every random suggestion deserves implementation. Most ideas, from any source, won't work out. The lesson is that every observation deserves consideration, and the person's rank or credentials shouldn't determine whether their input gets a fair hearing. This is easier said than done, especially in hierarchical organizations where authority and expertise are necessarily respected. But organizations that master this balance, that maintain necessary structure while staying open to insights from unexpected sources, are the ones most likely to adapt and innovate effectively.